Welcome to the State of the Nation. I'm your host, Mike Sham. Very excited today to have one of our leading columnists for a while before he went overseas to further his studies, Mr. Khaya Sithole. Khaya, welcome back to South Africa. For starters, I know you've been in and out of the country.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
And it's
sometimes.
Yeah, and obviously you come back in quite a tumultuous week, being State of the Nation, and I know you've done quite a bit of commentary around there, but you've also had the sight of countries that aren't South Africa. You spent most of the last year abroad.
Yeah.
And you walk into this. What were your views of well, let's first start off with South Africa.
Yeah. Look, I think obviously we have known for a very long time that the country is essentially in a state of drift. No one can say that the country is moving forward, and I think whether you look at the political ecosystem, whether you look at society itself, or even the economic fundamentals, we have simply stagnated. And I think that great reversal can be measured in many ways, but I think one of the most sobering statistics that sort of captures it is the very essence that, even those few of us that have managed to get an economic foothold, whether you've got a job or whether you are able to run a business, we've now found that being threatened by the inability of our leaders to actually run a country then accommodates that. So if you look at the type of businesses that have been forced out into the darkness through the load shedding crisis, and the jobs that they supported, which now quite simply do not exist and may never be recaptured again, that for me is an ongoing tragedy, because even those small businesses that survived were businesses that survived a rather hostile system that doesn't provide a fertile ground for a person to experiment with a business idea and then say, these are the opportunities for me to maximize it. So those that were surviving were doing it against all odds. That was fine. Now the state is actively sabotaging them by then making it so prohibitively expensive for them to maintain their businesses because the electricity is so unreliable. And of course, the electricity has been unreliable for 15 years. But what has become very clear is that you would have imagined at some point in time, somebody who's a leader would have said, well, the one way to insulate businesses from collapse is to then say, here's a fixed set schedule for how load shedding is going to work in these particular business nodes, so that at least even those businesses can plan around it. The haphazard nature in which load shedding has been rolled out in the past 6 months in particular has simply meant that anyone who has a plan is wasting their time. And I think there was an old expression, all the best laid plans of mice and men. You can sort of imagine how that ends. So I think it's been remarkably disappointing to see that not only do we have a crisis, but we do not seem to have leaders who can manage a crisis, because every country undergoes a crisis in one way or another, and the litmus test for how that country survives is how those leaders are able to respond to the nature of the crisis. We are not arguing that South Africa is a utopia or South Africa ought to be a utopia. We're simply saying that now that you do understand what your big crisis points are, and their recurring crisis points, you should have become better over time at managing those crisis moments. And that for me is the greatest disappointment of what South Africa finds itself in.
But Khaya, for the last nearly 3 decades, we've been told that the crisis was the stranglehold of white monopoly capital on the economy, on the country.
Yeah.
Every bit of legislation has gone that way. People have been cancelled. Companies have changed. The whole word transformation. You can't complete a sentence without having that word in it.
Yeah.
So, where is our problem? Is our problem that, or is our problem not that?
So I chuckled when you mentioned the idea of white monopoly capital, because I think there is an acknowledgement that the term itself was weaponized and politicized at a particular point in time when some political leaders or some political principles had an interest in polarizing society. So that has attracted very negative connotations. But before then, there was an acknowledgement that the structure and the form of the economy and the architecture of the economy historically had been created with particular views, with particular intentions. And what has become a big problem over the past 3 decades is that we haven't been able to break that structure of the economy and make it more open and make it more inclusive, so that if we want it to be responsive to where we are today, then it is able to do so. And I think what that does is that it unfortunately leads to a centralization of economic power amongst the incumbents. So if you look, for example, in the agriculture sector, in the farming sector, you've been hearing stories about farmers, small-scale farmers who are now going out of business simply because they quite simply cannot figure out how to run their operations in the absence of electricity. And of course, the ones that are able to then survive that are the big businesses who then say, well, we'll put in whatever irrigation systems are necessary, we'll get the right generators to get them. And of course, in the long run, the ultimate consequence of that is that if you had been saying that you're trying to diversify the economy by putting more new entrants into the market, when those new entrants get kicked out, then you go back to where you were. So that monopolistic structure is actually maintained on the basis that those that should have been given the opportunity to join that economic architecture are then excluded on the basis that we don't get the infrastructure question right, we don't get the energy question right. So I think even if we had a detailed plan of how we want to diversify the economy and open up the economy, the fact that smaller businesses are the ones that are always the first casualties of a crisis of infrastructure, of a crisis of service delivery, and of a crisis of energy, it simply means that we unfortunately look back 30 years later, we're still seeing far too many large-scale businesses that dominate economic sectors. So if you go to the agriculture sector, for example, you can probably find 5 big players. And those 5 big players are businesses that have been there for a very long time. And in South Africa, a very long time simply means that those were businesses that may have been started long before 1994, when the ability and the right to start a business was restricted for so many citizens. So you've seen that status quo being maintained, not because no one has acknowledged that we have a problem, but there have been so many setbacks since then that have just made it very difficult for us to dismantle the structure of that economy. So I think there's a very important historical context to where we find ourselves. And the tentative steps that we've tried to put in place to break that all haven't always had the intended outcomes. I still remain absolutely horrified about the fact that the architect of the transformation policies and BE policies then became the primary beneficiary of them and became a billionaire. Because if you then ask yourself the question that at the point in time when we said that we wanted to transform the economy, when you then, if I gave you 2 names, the designer of the system itself, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa, and a normal South African completely out of the political elite, and then ask yourself the question of whether those particular policies, or whether those particular initiatives were going to achieve equitable outcomes for those 2 citizens, the simple answer is no. Because what you end up with is that there are these high-profile billionaires who've done very well from the transformation project, and a lot of citizens who are now questioning even the validity of the transformation project because they don't see it translating to a more equitable economic dividend. So those are the type of problems that we've created, in that we've done all of these steps, and then in hindsight, we haven't got the right model. So what that then does is that it leads to a lot of people to then question the very legitimacy of those initiatives, the very legitimacy of those particular steps, because at the end of the day, all we can do is evaluate the outcomes. And if the outcomes are telling us that it's not working, we need to be honest and say, perhaps it's not the right way to do it, perhaps it's not the right models that we put in place, and then figure out how to do better. But I think, unfortunately, in political rhetoric, a lot of these conversations get demonized by the question of who's having the conversation, what their intention is about the conversation, and what interests they're trying to promote or protect in the course of that conversation.
So what should have happened? Quite simply put, I mean, if we can say that what was attempted was wrong, then we've got the benefit now of a long history of looking at this, and we obviously don't want to continue to compound the problem if we've got the wrong solution.
I think what was very unclear from inception is, in a national economic roadmap, what do you do when you then realize that a course of policy that you've undertaken is not getting you there? It's not getting those particular outcomes, particularly in a society where you're not going to see a big political shift. So in other countries, if you took the wrong policy decision and 2 or 3 years later everyone can see that it's the wrong policy decision, then they simply kick you out of office. So South Africa wasn't at that particular stage. So what you wanted to be able to figure out was, do we have a system in place, or do we have a government in place that is able to then say, look, this is the ultimate roadmap, this is what the pathway looks like. If at this particular milestones we evaluate it and we see that the outcomes are X, or rather, or versus the outcomes being Y, then it means that this is not the way we should continue, and this is how we need to adapt. And I think obviously we have struggled to do that, because for a lot of people that are part of the of the political elites and part of the political system, they found a way that works for them. So they don't have that presence of mind to say, but actually, the ultimate intention was for socially better outcomes. And if you had said that this would be for socially better outcomes, the question would have been asked the first time Mr. Tokyo Sekwale became a billionaire, the first time Mr. Sakima Kozoma became a billionaire, the first time Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa became a billionaire, you should have said, wait, hold on, was this the intention? Because if that was the intention, then perhaps we are not actually ever going to achieve those socially desirable outcomes. You're free to come back and tell me that our intention was to simply create a new class of industrialists and using BE as a guise for it. If that's the intention, then I'm happy to accept that, well, those that were in charge decided that's the way to go. But what was sold to us was the idea that we're going to put together these structures, we're going to put together these initiatives that are going to achieve socially more equitable outcomes than what we've seen before, and that didn't happen. So the question of what ought to have happened is that we should have had the presence of mind to understand that once we undertake particular courses of action and we do not get the right socially equitable outcomes, then this is what you need to do differently. The failure to do that has meant that we now have a socially polarized, a very polarized society on the basis that people keep asking the question, so what happened to the promises that were made? What happened to this particular windfall, whether it's economic, social, or political windfall that we expected to see? Because from where we are now, far too many citizens are saying, I just don't see it.
But before you went overseas, you were involved in the media, and we get this question in the media. You know, the answer seems to be clear that this is the way to go, and it's bad whites that aren't letting go of the levers of power.
Yeah, it's difficult in a country like ours to simply pin yourself to those binary polars of opinion, because what you have to figure out is a country that has the complexities that we have is unlikely to have a very clear binary answers of yes or no. There's always a lot of concessions or trade-offs associated with any particular decision. There's a lot of concessions or trade-offs associated with any particular policy direction. So if you look at what has become a rather difficult question for a lot of people, which is the stranglehold that white people have over the economy. It is very clear that at the point in time of the transition, the political players were not unaware of what the permutations were. You had the example of Idi Amin in Uganda and what he had done, and you had the example that eventually emerged in Zimbabwe, what Robert Mugabe had done. So the concessions and the trade-offs that they decided to put in place was to say, look, perhaps we do not want a model that leads to a mass exodus of business skills, however one defines it. If you look at what happened when the Indians left Uganda, for example. So that was something that would have been part of the deliberations that have consulted widely to say, well, what's the best way to manage a transition? And then they took a decision. They made a call that our transition is the one that ought to be more inclusive. And in that inclusion, we are not going to alienate those that are already running parts of the economy. We are going to try and facilitate a transition that ends up with a system where many more citizens are able to participate in the economy. That is a decision that was taken. And unfortunately, a lot of people in the public discourse tend to forget the fact that decisions do not always attract consequences. There are no, consequence-free decisions that you make, particularly when it comes to public policy, particularly when it comes to matters of the state. So once you've made that call, then you need to figure out to say that having created that particular decision-making tree, what are the potential permutations? And of course, in the long run, one of the questions would be, well, what if we never break the stranglehold of the economic concentration amongst white people? What will that do in relation to what we've promised our citizens at large? What will that say to the promise we've made to our constituents? And will we ever be able to explain how things have or have not worked? And I think the NC government has sort of struggled quite significantly with the question of the economic dimension and the economic paradigm. So what you end up doing is that we end up screaming past each other instead of saying, well, actually, having made this particular choice at the transition point, having seen what has happened since then, what is the best way to facilitate a model, a method, or whatever it is that then still gets us to the outcomes that we said that we're aiming for? Because I do think that a lot of people acknowledge that when you look at vision statement that Nelson Mandela, for example, had. It was a vision statement that said that, look, what we're trying to achieve here is universal access, universal participation in the economic systems, universal access, universal participation in the access to utilities, whether it's electricity, whether it's water. So those are the ideals that sort of bound them together. And those ideals are the ones that should have become the primary driving force of where we need to be. But I think over time, we just haven't always stayed on that path. So you do end up with the situation where there is indeed far too much economic power in the hands of few white people, and far too many black people that simply say that we actually do not see a way into this economy. We do not see how we're going to get in this particular treadmill, whether it's because we haven't had access to the right education, whether it's because we don't have access to the resources that are there, or whether it's because the system is so hostile to the idea of opening businesses, it's pointless to even start.
Sure, a lot to digest, and the one thing we know is that we can't set the clock back, more than a quarter of a century. All we're going to keep on doing, I'd imagine, is we don't want those 5 big agricultural companies to close because we'll starve to death. So what we'll do is we'll just make it a little bit more unpleasant by the day for those people to operate. That seems to be the methodology in practice at the moment.
It's a very, very strange state of affairs, because what you want to be able to honestly deliberate on is a question of, well, if you look at what the economy is able to do now. So if you look at the banking system, for example, and if you look at the big banks, and we can all agree that they do obviously have massive market power. The big 5 banks in particular essentially run the entire ecosystem, and everyone else is trying to piggy bank on it. And the question of, well, if we took the view that actually that particular bank doesn't look the way that we want it to look, and we then want to dismantle it in one way or another, what are the social consequences there? Because that particular bank is not only a business, it's a taxpayer, and it's an employer, and it's a corporate citizen, right? So when you then embark on a process of simply then saying, well, we're going to demonize you for the sake of demonizing you, we're going to dismantle you for the sake of dismantling you, you then also have to remember that you're accountable to the citizens that were part of that system. And the question of how you manage that system to say that it needs to be responsive to what the needs of the electorate are, it needs to be responsive to what our society in its current iteration requires, then that's a question of deliberate action plans, deliberate policy making, and deliberate engagements. And I think when you lose the ability to be deliberate in that constructive dimension, then you end up with the alternative where it's simply a matter of, well, we're going to scream them out of business. And I think you've seen some particularly unfortunate situations when, in the case of SAA, for example, if you look in the case of Mango and SA Express, those were organizations where people were saying long in advance that, look, perhaps the business model is not suited for where we need to be. Perhaps the governance model is not suited for where we need to be. And in the absence of fixing those things, well, all the people that you're saying you're protecting, who are the employees and who are the stakeholders there, well, it doesn't matter what you say about them, because once those business models collapse, then all of them are going to lose jobs anyway. So I think it's that type of thinking that sometimes doesn't seem to be very prevalent in the state. I mean, I was thinking about it on the driving on the way here now, in that the president said in his State of the Nation address that we need to be decisive in dealing with the energy crisis, And some of these things are easy wins. So you can imagine that there are particular economic hubs. So I was driving from the Sandton area to the Johannesburg area, and it was raining yesterday. So you know very well that if it was raining and then there's load shedding, then there's going to be an additional hour that you need to allocate to just going through the traffic. And the question must be, wait, hold on. If you then said that for as long as there's load shedding in these particular, busy intersections, whether it's in the CBDs, for as long as load shedding, surely it should now be a permanent issue that there must be mobile traffic officers to be able to direct the traffic, because it may not cut out the entire additional hour in traffic, but maybe it reduces to 45 minutes. And we're saying that in that 15 minutes that people are now able to get to the job, people are able to deliver services, people are able to produce goods, it actually minimizes or it reduces the impact on the economy. So even simple things like that do not seem to inform government thinking
Yes.
and government policy. So if you can't even get the simple wins like that, the simple question of, well, where are the manufacturing hubs of the country? The manufacturing hubs of the country need to be there. They need to be continuously operational, because that's where the food comes from. That's where the products that we sell come from. So why are they subject to the same load shedding that I, as a citizen, am subjected to? Because let's face it, at some point in time, you have to make very difficult decisions. and the issue that I may complain that there are no lights in my house between 10 and 12 is not the same, should not have the same resonance as a factory saying that we were not able to operate during the course of the day, and once the lights came back at 4, all our employees had to go back home, so there's nothing to do anyway. It's a difficult conversation, but this is where we're. This is how you deal with the crisis.
But obviously, a couple of things that sort of stick in my mind immediately with that example that you used is, for starters, the politicians aren't spending that extra hour in the traffic, right? Because they're zooming through with their blue lights, so they're okay.
They're zooming twice. They're zooming on the cars and also zooming at home if they don't want to go to physical meetings.
So they're okay.
Yeah.
They're not living amongst us in that regard. And then, of course, there is the thing that and we're going to go into the State of the Nation address in a minute. You also seem to have a complete disconnect with the government and their understanding of where their tax money comes from, right? Because they seem to move heaven and earth to malign taxpayers in this country and to do everything in their power to disempower the taxpayer. And ultimately, that is a little bit like sitting on the wrong side of the branch with the saw, right? And you up there, and you there's a chance the branch is going to fall down, and you're on the wrong side of it.
Yeah.
But let's go to the State of the Nation address. It seems that just recently it caught the government, especially the president, by total surprise that load shedding was a problem. Right?
He has the habit of getting shocked.
We know that he gets shocked by the smallest detail, but it seems like suddenly they realized, oh, hell, load shedding is a problem after 15 years.
Yeah.
And he then proceeded to ramble on for hours at his address. And do you understand the logic of saying the problem seems to be a structural one with Eskom? So what we're going to do is we're going to give the head of Eskom, whoever that may be, because it's obviously not going to be Andre de Ruyter, we're going to give him 4, if not 5 people to report. And that's going to make him do a better job.
Yeah.
Right? What did you make of his absolutely incoherent State of the Nation address?
Well, I think it would be wrong to say that one was surprised, because I think in spite of what we all hoped for, in spite of what we all wished for, the president has spent 5 years showing us that decision-making is not the type of thing that he wants to be remembered for. And what you've then seen is that even in that conversation about Eskom, you would have had to say that surely somebody in his inner circle would have said, actually, this is enough. You're creating far too many alternative centers of power with diminished and very varying levels of accountability. So the fact that Eskom sits in the Department of Public Enterprises means that the Minister of Energy is able to freestyle about just how much better it would be if it was under his department, because at the end of the day, you have to remember that the Ministry of Public Enterprises is a very strange creature of state in that the energy department can say that we oversee all the energy policy of the country, everything is housed here, and these are the particular enterprises that report to us. So you can see the coherence there. It is difficult to imagine that a Minister of Public Enterprises that oversees aviation assets, that oversees Danone, that oversees Transnet, the logistics asset, and also oversees an electricity asset, can ever have a coherent policy framework, because you simply have to say that these things are so completely irreconcilable. So you'd have thought that at some point in time the president would say, well, now that this is a crisis, it surely cannot be useful to crisis management to have these multiple centers of accountability. And of course it goes in the other way, it creates a new center of layer of accountability, which left a lot of people confused. But I think for a lot of people, we cannot be dishonest and say we were surprised. It's not surprising anymore.
And then, Khaya, another big feature of the Sona address, was this continued centralization of power in the presidency.
Yeah.
Are we making a similar error here that was made when, there's always the big sort of talking point has always been that a lot of the constitution was, and the electoral system was done with Nelson Mandela as the leader in mind, right? Cyril Ramaphosa seems to be doing all the centralization of the president of power in the presidency as parallel government of his.
Yeah, it looks like we're moving from a super ministry, which is what the Department of Public Enterprises started looking like, to a super presidency. And I think when it started, the president put the infrastructure office, Josiento Ramokgopa ran that, and now we're going to have, we also had the climate finance being centralized then. We have what we believe is the anti-bureaucracy red tape regime by Sipongosi being centered there. And of course, now the Minister of Electricity is going to be there. So it is reflective of a bigger problem that we still probably don't know how to deal with, in the question of, well, what happens when the president legitimately feels that that department is just never going to do what he wants it to do because its policy prescripts are something that is far removed from his influence and from his control? And so is it ever legitimate for him to bring it closer? And I think also, quite importantly, state security agencies is another one that has been centralized there. So the question is it ever useful to be able to centralize that? And I have particular reservations about that particular model. I think that, what departments tend to have is not only the policy head or the political head, they also have the bureaucrats within the system, and they also have the technocrats within the system. So it's much easier to seamlessly put things together within the ambit of a particular department. We're not particularly sure how well it works, for example, if you have, let's say, Patricia DeLille's department, I'm trying to remember, the Public Works, for example, and then you've got infrastructure sitting in the presidency, and the question of, well, if Angie Motshekga needs to build a school tomorrow, who does she go to? Do we regard it as a big infrastructure project that needs to be prioritized? If the state then decides that perhaps we need to create, I don't know, some new power station, for example, which is a bad example, is it where the infrastructure budget should be earmarked? Should you then simply say to ESCOM, well, go and look at it on your own? Is it a public works thing? So it does unfortunately create a big sense of confusion around who's accountable for what. And I think it is in the lack of accountability where the paralysis once again sets in, where you're saying, well, actually, what has happened since we put the infrastructure department under the ambit of the presidency? Is the state security agency much more effective now that it reports to the presidency? And you could ask the same questions even with the Minister of Electricity. So it is a concern about what is the big vision. Is he of the view that the closer they are to him, the better he's able to monitor them and ensure that they execute on his mandate? Or is it simply the matter of having lost faith in the line ministries and the people already deployed there, and then say, well, actually, I'll take it away from you, even if I don't take away the political position from you?
But it seems to be that the answer is more the latter. Right?
We know the answer.
But we know the answer, but it's not only that. It speaks to a bigger problem, and that is that he is not, we understand that with his lack of backbone, he's not going to fire people.
Yeah.
But if one were to give him credit for being this Yoda-like figure that sometimes he likes to portray himself as, there's just no talent, is there?
Yeah, that's a scary part. Because quite interestingly, you may argue that he hasn't had the courage to fire people, but for once a decision was taken out of his hands. They told him what to do, because the ANC conference simply said, dissolve public enterprises, send everybody back to where they belong. So the expectation last week was to say, well, actually, we've decided to send ESCOM back to the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, and perhaps to manage the tensions, the civil war between Pravin Gordhan and Gwede Mantashe, you then say, well, Gwede Mantashe's primary interest is in the mining part of the portfolio. So perhaps that becomes a standalone portfolio, and energy becomes a standalone portfolio. And if you insist that Pravin Gordhan must have as a very senior job, then that's perhaps where you allocate him. So in spite of his own delegates having said that not only must you undertake a process of dissolving this, but you must specifically take ESCOM to a new house, he seems to have said, no, actually, that's not what I'm going to do. So it's quite surprising that he has found a way to defy that particular instruction when they literally made a decision for him that he's been struggling with for months, because it's been very clear that our best intentions and Pravin Gordhan's best intentions notwithstanding, it quite simply hasn't worked out. Either that portfolio is not working out, or him being in that portfolio hasn't worked out. And there's nothing wrong with acknowledging that. The president hasn't done so because he has kept him there, in spite of the fact that, come on, this is where the crisis institutions are, and we don't seem to be moving forward at getting the right solutions. And the interference that the minister has been accused of, his lethargy in appointing board members, the ESCOM previous board complained about the fact that they were left in limbo. Even with the unbundling process. Remember, they said they're setting up this separate companies, and the director now tells us that, oh, actually, we sent them names of prospective board members a year ago, and they haven't bothered to respond. So we are not saying this out of malice. Pravin Gordhan quite simply hasn't performed.
Are we not having an extremely boring conversation right now? Right? Right? No,
It's a repetition of what we've been through over the years.
I'll tell you why. To me, it's an extremely boring conversation. Is that I recall 1992, 1993, and watching the then SABC, one which was being managed largely by the National Party, discussing National Party policy. And the rest of the world could see that it didn't really matter because they weren't really going to be in power once there was an election.
Yeah.
Right? So, yeah, we are prattling on. And people must be hell of a bored out there listening to what the ANC are doing wrong, right? Should we not be having a different conversation altogether? And the different conversation is, especially for people like ourselves, should we not be talking about South Africa in the post-ANC world?
Yeah, so I think obviously 2024 is a big litmus test for the country's democracy. I think the evidence that has been gathered by pollsters in at different time intervals seems to indicate that the ANC is under serious threat of losing its majority. And of course, once it loses that majority, then we have a much bigger question of then who governs the country, because the country still has to be governed one way or another. And for me, why that's of particular interest, particularly when it comes to policy deliberations, is that my anxiety is that because you're going to have this power sharing, this blend of decision making, you are probably going to discover that in the long run, the policies that currently exist that the ANC has crafted are the ones that are going to stand the test of time. Because if you get to the post-2024 dispensation and there's a new government or a coalition government or an amalgamation of the parties, then they say that this is the one policy that shouldn't persist. It's very difficult to get everybody to be of the same view and then say this is the way to go forward. So imagine if you have a coalition, for example, involving the EFF and the Freedom Front Plus and the DA, which is what we've seen in some of the metro and some of the municipalities. And then the question gets put on the table about how should we reform or how should we deal with Section 25 of the Constitution. You already know that the Freedom Front is definitely not going to agree with what the EFF says, and the DA is definitely not going to agree with what the EFF says, in spite of the fact that they're in a governing coalition. So the problem that you're going to say is that, well, actually, we may never get a vote that ever, changes or upends any existing ANC policy. So we may be stuck with these policies for much longer than we're stuck with the ANC, until you get to a particular point in time when there's enough parties with the same meeting of the minds to then say, well, actually, that policy, we universally agree, it should be repealed, it should be reversed because of what we're trying to achieve. Whether we're going to get there in the short run, I'm not convinced.
It does look like the battle lines have been drawn, though. If you look at recent events, you've had the ANC and the EFF upending the DA-led coalitions here in Gauteng. Seemingly, Gayton McKenzie and his Patriotic Alliance have thrown in their lot with that. The half on again, off again love affair with the IFP, that's now seemed to be kicked into touch. So the IFP are going to be part of the other coalition. And we're sort of heading towards a de facto two-party system, right? Or two-movement system.
Maybe two coalition system.
Two coalition system, however you want to call it. But it's going to be that.
Yeah.
The question starts becoming under whose leadership. Now, we know that in the 1960s liberation faction, it's going to be led by Julius Malema. We understand that because there's nobody in the ANC that can lead that coalition. There's just nobody. I mean, my God, if Cyril's bad, we had to endure Paul Mashatile, and he's going to be just a worse version of Cyril, isn't he? Right?
I think it might be a bit more decisive. The question is, would we be comfortable with the decisions it takes?
Well,
that's always the risk that we have to face.
Yeah, when he was heading up Gauteng, he showed no inclination, other than theft. He showed no inclination towards leadership. I don't see that changing, right? And of course, there's big question marks over the other side of a coalition. And I've had my say on this. I don't see a white DA being a white-led DA being everybody's champion, and I don't see a President Steenhuisen.
It's difficult to imagine that. And I think, one of the difficulties that these parties have to deal with is the fact that you have to figure out what is the most electable way in 2024, if you want to put it like that. And I think the way our society is and the position that we're in, it's difficult to imagine that the DA will form the view that they will want to run with Steenhuisen as a presidential candidate and believe that they stand a very good chance. It's just, South African society is not at that stage yet. But again, we're not making this up. The DA itself has acknowledged it previously, because Mampela Rampele was an example of them acknowledging that, well, actually, we quite simply do not believe that the face of Helen Zille, for example, in the ballot box as a presidential candidate is going to get us there. So it's not a party that's unaware of the social dynamics of South Africa today. Now, whether they still have any leaders within the DA that they can say that in spite of the leader being Steenhuisen, for example, this is going to be our presidential candidate, that's a conversation that the DA needs to have, particularly ahead of April, because that's when they have their next elective conference, and then leading up to next year. The problem is that whichever way they go, it's going to come with a backlash, because if they find someone who looks like me and then they elevate them, everyone will say, well, of course, you're just a proxy, because clearly they didn't believe you're good enough to lead the party up until now, so no one's going to take you seriously, so you have a legitimacy crisis there. But also, on the other hand, if you then keep the head of the incumbent leader on the ballot box, you are then making a very, very ambitious call that South African voters at that point in time will say, well, in spite of the fact that we have anxieties, we're still going to vote for Steenhuisen as president, and I do not believe that our society is at that stage yet.
So now, I was at a crucial stage in my life when South Africa, the old South Africa, had to make the decision, and whether we move forward or disappear into the abyss, right? We are now very much at a similar situation, right? And surely our future has to be guided by one particular group. And, the real value, you've got to hand it to Jacob Zuma. He really, in one statement, managed to silence so much dissent. And that is when he put the tag on people like yourself and called them clever blacks, right? And it seems to me that from that moment on, every sort of successful black person has just absolutely retreated into silence.
Yeah. Right? I think there's been a very, very explicit retreat from political participation in particular. Political conversations still happen in the background, but far too many people have felt that the system was gravitating towards a point where you would demonize people who had different ways of thinking. And the ANC in particular wasn't known for embracing different ways of engaging with the political process. And I think that type of silencing has been self-defeating for the party itself, because even some of its most passionate supporters, who just happen to have different ways of thinking, different ways of engaging, they found the system becoming increasingly hostile towards them. And then so they've simply disengaged from it. And I think that that's been to the detriment of the ANC itself. So you see some of the decisions that get taken, some of the conferences that that you see playing out there, and then you simply try to ask yourself, well, where is the ideological and the intellectual core of this party? Where is this party deliberating on what the future of the party looks like, and what the future of the country looks like, and what the future of the world looks like, and how do the conversations that they have feed into that? Do they illustrate an ability to understand that, look, you are no longer a revolutionary party, but you are a party in government, and you're governing an evolving society, and it becomes increasingly difficult to see that within the ANC deliberations.
So, I'm happy to act as the spokesman for the whites, and now I've just appointed you as a spokesman for the clever blacks, right?
I'm not a clever black, but yeah, I don't think I'm clever at all.
Well, your results say otherwise, and your achievements, but it's a real matter of concern, because it seems like to me that the line chosen by young black professionals is to sit on the side and then say, you see afterwards, which is quite a nice sort of comfortable thing. You don't make a decision, you don't support the ANC, but then you don't support the opposition parties, and you wait for it all to kind of go the wrong route, and you say, you see, I told you so.
Yeah, it's a difficult space to be in, because obviously once people lose faith in a party that they identify with ideologically, it takes a lot more doing from an alternative party or from an opposition party to convince them to swing. in that particular direction, because we're not a country where voting is compulsory. So if a person simply says, look, I like my party, but I just don't think I can endorse them today, then a person just sits out the process. And of course, what that does is that it entrenches the incumbency of the party that you disagree with at that particular point in time. And I think for a lot of black professionals, there is a very difficult question about, well, what are the alternatives out there? And I think what you saw in 2009 in particular, because when COPE was formed, it was so ideologically similar to the ANC. Even people that were opposed to what was happening with the ANC internally found that a natural home to gravitate towards to, because you felt that actually I like those ideologies, I may not like the people or the political principles executing on them at this particular point in time. So that was a natural transition, and of course COPE decided to implode, which didn't help the cause. And since then, it's been very difficult to find that sort of easy transition point. 2013 obviously happens, and the EFF emerges, and of course it appealed to particular voters that it said, well, actually, we've got particular anxieties, we've got particular concerns about the ANC. It doesn't talk about these issues as explicitly as I want it to be. And then the EFF then became the party that was quite explicit about those particular issues. So then it attracted those that had said, well, actually, I think you need to be a bit more robust in talking about land. I think you need to be a bit more robust in talking about, the concentration of economic power. So that obviously catered to a particular audience. But I think the interesting thing about black voters in particular and historic ANC voters is that they're not monolithic. They are quite diverse, and people have got particular interests and particular persuasions. So when you see new parties emerge from that, you will never see a universal walk away from the ANC. There's never going to be a party that says, we're going to be a replica of the ANC. They may take parts of it, and then you'll see the attraction towards the EFF, you'll see the attraction towards COPE, but the ANC will be here for a bit more time. I don't know if it will be as powerful and as influential as it has been in the past, but yeah, there is that sense of anxiety about, well, where exactly do you go? And a lot of citizens, a lot of voters haven't found an answer yet. So they sit at home and they watch it all on TV.
What we do know is people gravitate towards leadership. There's definitely leadership being shown in the EFF. We may not like the leadership. There's definitely leadership being shown in the DA, but it may be a little bit sort of
a bit polarizing.
A bit polarizing.
Alienating,
You've got some leadership amongst the smaller parties, but they remain that smaller parties. But we're heading towards an election. So you went overseas. You probably spent some time. You went to a whole lot of educational institutions. I think you might even have spent some time at Hogwarts.
I should have. It would have been less horrific than here.
And maybe got out your crystal ball. And in the view of Khaya Sithole, sitting here in 18 months' time, what does South Africa look like?
I think South Africa wakes up in a state of confusion, in that there will be provinces that suddenly have a new government altogether, and I think we can sort of predict that Gauteng will be one of those provinces. The Western Cape remains in the hands of the DA. The
KZN?
IFP makes significant inroads in KZN, and I'm not sure if they'll get over the line on their own. They may be in government with other parties, because if you look at the work that's been done at a micro level by Mayor Chris Pappas in particular, it is suddenly making the DA a bit more marketable in places where it previously wasn't such. So I think that then opens up a space for a proper three-way contest, which is something we haven't had in KZN for a very long time. I think on the national ballot, I still do not believe that the alternative parties have done enough to marshal the type of grassroots movement that the ANC is going to unleash on them from the 8th of January next year all the way up to the general election. And if that's grassroots movements, whether it's through the unions, whether it's through the churches and through other elements of civil society, decides to give the ANC one last chance, then the ANC still emerges ahead. Whether it is on a standalone basis or in coalition with other parties, I still think that South African society still prefers to gamble with what they know rather than what they don't know.
Is that with the head or the heart?
It's more of a hard conversation these days. I think it's more of a hard conversation because if you looked at it with the head, I mean, anyone who cannot guarantee me electricity supply should not be in charge of anything that controls my electricity grid. It should be that straightforward, but it isn't.
Khaya, Thank you so much for coming in. We've had to fight a whole lot of things in getting this together, including load shedding, our favorite thing. But thank you so much for joining us on the State of the Nation. If you've enjoyed this insight, please subscribe to our channel. We'll be bringing you more great analysis from people like Khaya. Khaya, once again, thank you very much. And to everybody that joined us today, thank you so much. And we'll see you the next time on the State of the Nation.